For those who've been away in previous lesson, we're in Acts chapter 14. We finished at verse 7 last time, and so we'll be continuing from verse 8. And this morning, doing Acts chapter 14, verses 8 to 18. So, let me read first the full passage, and then we'll go from there. So, where are we? Wrong chapter. Okay. 14, 8. There we go. 8, correct. So, Acts chapter 14, verses 8 to 18. And at Lystra, a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man listened to Paul as he spoke, who, when he fixed his gaze upon him and saw that he had faith to be saved from being lame, said with a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he leapt up and began to walk. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have become like men and have come down to us." They began calling Barnabas Zeus and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, and was wanting to offer sacrifice with the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, proclaiming the gospel to you, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways, and yet he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling your hearts with food and gladness." And saying these things, with difficulty they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, we have an interesting passage this morning that contains a fascinating event that has important implications for a number of theological issues that we'll kind of work our way through as we progress through the text. So, have a look at our beginning in verse 8. So, they are at Lystra. For those who have their maps with them, this journey began in Antioch. They crossed over to Cyprus. Having crossed the Isle of Cyprus, they then sailed north up to Italia, to Perga. They then moved up through Pisidia to Pisidian Antioch, or Antioch in Pisidia, where we've been in chapter 13, obviously. Then they've now moved across to Iconium, which is where they were at the beginning of this chapter 14. And then now they've gone directly south, a couple of dozen kilometres to Lystra is where they are. And so the story kind of picks up there as we've now moved through. Okay, verse 8. And at Lystra, a man was sitting who had no strength in his feet, lame from his mother's womb, who had never walked. So this is obviously a relatively familiar scene for those acquainted with the New Testament scriptures. There are a number of examples of things similar to this in the Gospels, of course, in the time of Christ, of those who were physically lame for one reason or another. This one obviously is giving us context here. Luke is giving us the context of he had been born obviously with a deformity from his mother's womb and who had never walked. That's a tough enough life today with wheelchairs and advanced medical technology that far surpasses anything that the ancients could have even dreamed of, let alone someone 2,000 years ago. That's an unfathomably and almost incomprehensibly difficult life. Having to be almost certainly taken care of 24/7 by those around him. You have to have had family helping him, because if you didn't, you just literally would not survive at all. We've encountered, in the Gospels, we encounter a similar scenario of a man who had been lame for, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, 40 years, we're told. And so, if that number's correct off memory.
38.
38, there you go. So I'm rounding in my head, there we go. 40 plus,
It's
40 plus
actually the number of rebelliousness in the Bible.
It is, yeah. So 40 plus or minus, and by plus or minus I mean -2. And so it is, yeah, it's associated with that. And so, yeah, so we're told he's brought to and fro and blah, blah. In this case, again, similar scenario. Now, it's going to get into, the wording will become important here in a minute, so let's keep reading. This man listened to Paul as he spoke, who, when he's in referring to Paul, when Paul fixed his gaze upon him and saw that he had the faith to be saved from being lame, he said with a loud voice, "Stand upright upon your feet." Different translations are probably going to come to a different conclusion on the end of verse 9 there. What does KJV have, Jen? End of verse 9?
In 9.
Had faith to be what?
Perceiving that he had faith to be healed.
Yep, that's acceptable enough. What was your one say, Dan?
This is
Right.
American Standard.
Okay, yep. American
It
Standard.
says, and listening to Paul he spoke, and when he had fixed his gaze upon him, and had seen, he had the faith to be made well.
Yeah. So it's the root word being used here is sozo, which is the generic word that we get for salvation, to be saved, right? Encapsulated, that's why I wanted to see what different ones had. To be the Legacy Standard Bible I'm using has saved. The word sozo contains within it the concept of restitution, of rescue, of being healed is within what we call the semantic domain. So semantic domain referring to, here's the spectrum of English words that we could use to translate this word, right? The meaning behind it, right? So being rescued is part of it. Being healed is contained within that semantic domain. The most direct translation would be saved, but it's understanding the kind of imagery it's being used in sozo. It's important then for our understanding of healing also. It's not unacceptable at all to translate even in this particular form. Let me see what actual specific form it's in here in verse 9. Pistin, yeah. To sothenai. So it's in the aorist infinitive, which means to have it, right? To possess in the past tense. What he's pointing to here is healing is a perfectly fine translation for that, but it's about understanding what's meant by that. When it's saying that Paul has cast his gaze upon, and this goes, by the way, so this also goes for the gospel accounts as well, so it's not, I'm trying to give you the broad spectrum answer. When he's listening to, of course, Paul preaching, right? He's listening to the gospel being presented, the truth of God being expounded. And he has the faith to be saved. He has the faith to be rescued from darkness, from sin, from death, from detachment to God, right? Or from God, rather. He has the faith to be healed of the most important nature, spiritually. That comes, in this case, by virtue of obviously the signs and wonders being done to testify to the validity of the prophetic message being given, right? That which Christ brought. Includes in this particular case his physical restoration. But thinking that physical healing is an automatic accompaniment of spiritual salvation fails to grasp the understanding of the word in Greek, right? It fails to understand the reasoning and more importantly, the pragmatic usage for its employment here. He has the faith to save, right, is what's being said here. At a fundamental level, that is addressing the more important, deeper matters, which is hearing the gospel and responding to it, right? Hearing the need to repent of sinfulness and of lawlessness and turn to Christ as the only Saviour in the world. He's hearing the gospel being presented. He's hearing the teaching and preaching of Paul, which has been the same throughout this missionary journey, right? And he then knows that he needs to be saved from darkness. He knows he needs to be saved from his sins. That's the inherent, basic, and the most important aspect of how this word is being used in terms of being saved, being rescued, being healed. Being healed of the curse of sin is the fundamental premise that's being described. Physical healing is the surface level. What I'm trying to do is point us to the deeper things of the text, yeah? And so, we could sit here talking quite a while about that, but the basic thing is when physical healing from God becomes the primary focus, you've lost sight of the meaning of the word, right? And you've lost sight of the meaning of how this word gets used in context, more importantly. The spiritual salvation of one's soul is what the fundamental premise of that concept of rescuing. It's God rescuing you from darkness. It's rescuing you from the way, and Paul goes on to address this, the way that the nations have gone, even in his day, for thousands of years. Okay, that has implications for what he then says later on as well. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. So Paul says in verse 10, he says to him, we're wrong verse. There we go. He says to the man in a loud voice, right, which also inherently assumes that there's a crowd. He's not just talking to one guy. Stand upright upon your feet, right? So get up and walk, right? In other words, similar wording that we found in Christ's ministry. And then the crowd and he leaped up and began to walk. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have become like men and come down to us. Okay. This tells us a couple of things that then set up how we understand this odd, well, to us seemingly odd remark, not an odd remark to them. One, the fact that Luke goes to the effort of mentioning that they're speaking in the Lycaonian language, which I'll get onto that in a minute, what that means, tells us that he's speaking before a Gentile audience. Okay? The rest of that context, that context is given to us when, it's not today's lesson, but in the next lesson, we begin in verse 19, Luke changes direction and then says, but the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came, right? So he's then contrasting the story we've just heard in 8 to 18, Gentile audience, right, Hellenic audience, with the Jews coming in. So he's not talking to Jews, he's very clearly talking to Gentiles, and the context makes that clear. The fact that they use this particular dialect, now we're not terribly sure what this dialect was. We don't have any broader reference of it beyond this point in the mid-1st century. So when it went extinct, how long after this it went extinct, we're not sure, but this is the last reference in history we get to it. It's likely that likely maybe is too strong a word. There's a reasonable probability that it is a rather old either Greek dialect or a Greek dialect somehow intermingled with an old Hittite dialect. Anatolia, right, which is this broad region that we call Turkey today, is historically the home, certainly these central parts of Anatolia are the lands of the Hittites, the ancient Hittite peoples. There are more than just Hittite people just in this part of the world. There were Hittites in the land of Canaan as well, in and around the land of Canaan, which if you went back 200 years ago, most scholars would have laughed at you if you said that there were Hittites in Canaan, right up until we discovered
the Hittites
in Canaan, right up until we discovered entire cities of Hittites, which is also just a broad point. But if I can just jump on a tangent for just hopefully a minute or two. We need to be really, really careful about what we think we do and don't know about history, pretending that we've somehow learned everything that there is to learn about history and that we can't possibly know, that X can't possibly be true because A, B, and C. People thought that the Trojan War was just pure mythology, and that Homer in the Iliad was writing nothing but absolute 100% fantasy stuff, right up until they discovered not only did they discover Troy, they discovered like the 9 Troys that there's been just built on each other over the course of history, building up, being destroyed, building up, being destroyed. All kinds of other things. And that goes for the Hittites as well. Again, the biblical references to Hittites in Canaan was thought to be like bona fide proof that the Old Testament was a load of hogwash, right up until Hittite cultures were excavated and discovered in Canaan, right? It's just like the dodo bird, right? People thought that the dodo bird was complete myth, even though the dodo bird had been written about in the islands around the Indian Ocean, all but like a decade prior, and it took about a decade for no offense, Ponzi scholars in Europe to think that it was just straight up myth. Right up until then, of course, the dodo bird the evidence for it was rediscovered. Be very careful about ruling things out of history and the kind of modern scholastic arrogance of thinking that we know everything about everything. Getting back onto the point, what this particular dialect was, we're not 100% sure the history of the region, but it's quite old, and it's a dialect. When saying language, it's saying like tongue in a literal sense, but it would have been a dialect. What that specifically means is really up for debate. The Lycaonians certainly are a distinct, not necessarily ethnic group, like you think of the Greeks or the Israelites, right? But they are their own distinct group and had been for probably at least 1,000 years by this point. And so he's coming to a particular place, but culturally they were very, very Hellenistic, okay? And that's the references we get here. What we then end up seeing happen is, in response to this man being miraculously healed, but more importantly, again, first saved and then blessed by God with being physically restored, he obviously was probably known to people, again, perfectly logically to infer that. And then people see this man who they've known has been lame since birth, just through malformation, and their first response is then, again, as Gentiles, is this must be the gods come to us. Now, this seems odd to us. There's nothing even remotely odd about this 2,000 years ago in Greek culture, because half the time when a stranger walked into a village, people were questioning whether or not this was a god visiting them. I say that tongue in cheek, but that's the Greeks are the home. Greece is the home of famous kind of logical philosophers as well as unfathomably superstitious people. Am I right or wrong?
No more or less, I must say.
Well, yes, that's true. Than other people, yeah.
Than the Israelites.
Yep, no, I agree with you on that. Yes, I agree with you on the comparative side.
I'm not trying to defend the Greeks.
I know. No more comparative.
I'm astounded at all our superstitiousness.
Oh, yeah.
Even Christians.
Yeah, and we do, yeah, and even things today. We posit ourselves to be very rational and empirical people who are the exact same culture that prints, star signs in Women's Weekly. Be careful about how we do it. But yes, the point I was trying to do it.
I think the point of talking in Lycaonian here, so Paul would have been speaking to them in the Greek of the time.
Yeah, he was speaking, yeah.
And they of course understood that. And then they reverted to their base local dialect because they were so immediately shocked in their pagan sensibilities.
Exactly, which is what I'm about to get on you, yeah.
It's so pagan.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Deeply so. Yep. And their response.
But the Lord delivered them.
Yeah, exactly. The Lord delivered them from it. Yeah. And so the response in specific terminology is the gods have become like men and come down to us. There's nothing particularly like contextually special about the reference. It's a pretty generic reference even into the Greeks. But they are hearkening to something that doesn't get referenced here because it's not the broader point. It's kind of the point, but not the big point. In Lycaonia, you had this local fable or tale that once upon a time, as most Greek stories go, Zeus and Hermes visited the city.
Oh, I see.
Okay. seeking hospitality, and all they were rejected by all but one woman, and she invited him for a meal and blah blah, and her in reward of that. I'm paraphrasing this story. I'm condensing it a lot, so keep that in mind. But long story short, her house was transformed into a golden temple, basically. Okay, and so most pagan societies, and the Greeks were no exception to this. The interactions and stories of interactions with the gods as these spiritual beings is something that kind of is a very consistent thread throughout the mythical history of that given culture. It's no different for the Romans. It's no different for the Norse and the Danes, right? The Vikings, the Germanic peoples, right? It's no different for various other cultures, Babylonians, the Egyptians, all kinds of things. The lines between the spiritual and the physical are very much intertwined. And the reality is that they are intertwined. It's just that we, in our post-Enlightenment rational empiricism, tend to think of things in like purely material forms, because that's the current problem with our own cultural philosophy. That part aside, it is basically a 100% fact that that's the story that they're thinking of. Okay, it doesn't make any other sense for the people of Lystra, of all people, to be specifically thinking of Zeus and Hermes, right? Of all people. So who were they? So Dios, right? Zeus, king of the gods in Greece, king of the Olympian gods. His equivalent to the Romans was Jupiter. He is, as I mentioned, king of the gods. He's kind of associated with thunder and lightning and the storm, but he is the king of the gods. Okay, the king of the pantheon of the Hellenic gods, the Greek gods, known as the Olympians, right, or the Olympian gods. Hermes is specifically equated with Mercury to the Romans, so you're probably more familiar with the term Mercury, hence the naming of the planet. He is the winged messenger, among other functions, but primarily as a messenger or a herald of the gods. He is also the attendant of Zeus. Okay, so it's not uncommon or infrequent to see Hermes and Zeus appearing in the same stories kind of consistently through. Okay, hence why they featured in that story, which was associated with Lystra. We know that, by the way, if you're wondering where on earth am I getting that from. We get a fairly solid accounting of that in Ovid's Metamorphoses. So Metamorphoses was the ancient poetry from this time period, written by the Roman poet Ovid, who was one of the great Roman poets from this time. And in his magnum opus called the Metamorphoses, he writes about this story. That was published in when Christ was a child. And so we get that story in, I think, book 8 of Metamorphoses, and you can read about that story. So they see this happen, and they see this miraculous event, and the first thing that pops into their pagan mind is this very famous story from their city, okay? And whether they think it's happening again, or what they specifically think, that can be maybe debated, but they're very clearly hearkening to memory, that story, and they probably clearly think that either something like that's happening again, or that is just happening again, right? Whatever does in that ballpark, whatever you happen to think. And so they begin calling Barnabas Zeus, and they call Paul Hermes. There's a couple of reasons why that would be the case. And we're told in part, again, Luke gives you the inference there at the end of verse 12, because he is in referring to Paul as the chief speaker. Again, Hermes was the herald of the gods. He was very, very eloquent in speech, and is consistently portrayed that way throughout ancient Greek mythology. And so the confidence and the eloquence of Paul's rhetoric, his speaking, would have drawn them towards that visage. Also, the fact of Paul's appearance. Again, sometimes we get little hints here and there as to people's appearance in the scriptures, and then we get that as well from kind of the early church fathers as well, who were like coming down from the successors. Some of whom obviously were eyewitnesses to the apostles. Paul was not a big man at all. Was comparatively shorter. He was older. He was slight of frame, almost certainly bald. and was nothing physically imposing in any sense. It's probably part of the reason why he was chosen to do the kind of job that he did to the Gentiles, because he was the antithesis of the ideal man certainly at least in the Hellenistic mind. You're laughing. Certainly at least in the Hellenistic mind, right? In the Greco-Roman concept. Barnabas, probably almost certainly the opposite. There are early church fathers who remark that Barnabas was tall and strong, right? A strong frame. And so that is almost certainly why he gets associated with Zeus, right? Again, he hasn't really done much in the, because again, keep in mind, it's Paul who's been talking. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, speaking, yeah. And so I'm using logical inference here, knowing the ancient Greek mindset and trying to put it into how this story is written for us by Luke. They probably thought that Barnabas was the one actually healed him, and that Hermes, Paul, was the one who was proclaiming it and saying it, and they're working in tandem together, right? Because again, Hermes is not necessarily the concept, but he is the attaché of Zeus in many ways, and is commonly associated with him. Again, that's just using inference. But long story short, they very clearly, as we're told, think that Barnabas is Zeus and that Paul is Hermes. Okay. So much so that in verse 13, the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, again, and this is the temple that the founding story for that, right? And so the temple of Zeus at Lystra, which is known, it's just outside the city. He starts bringing oxen and garlands to the city gates, and was wanting to offer sacrifices with the crowds. Okay, this is a fairly prototypical response on the part of these Hellenistic pagans. Okay. They're reacting they're not reacting in any odd way for their cultural circumstance, okay? But they need to put a stop to it immediately, right? Verse 14, but when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd. Pause there for 1 sec. There's been debate as to the use of the word apostolos here, by virtue of the fact that it's referring to it in the plural, and it's the one and only reference to Barnabas as an apostle. Whether it's referring to him, in this case, apostoloi, as the plural, titularly or functionally, is theologically debated. I would suggest probably functionally, if I had to lean one way or the other. By titular versus functional, what I mean is titular is in referring to title, kind of like capital A, apostle, versus the actual like pragmatic, the functional meaning of apostolos, meaning a messenger, right? Yeah. The one sent the one sent out, right, as a messenger, the one sent down on a mission, right? That's where we get the English word apostle, which is just a transliteration of apostolos from. Whether it's titular or functional here has been theologically debated, because we don't have any other indication that Barnabas was an eyewitness specifically to the resurrected Christ. And so that's a kind of fundamental criteria of what we think of conventionally as the 12 apostles, keeping in mind that's really like 12 plus 1, because it's the 12 apostles plus Paul, but he's his own kind of class. Nevertheless, the point being though is it's referring to the fact that they are messengers, right? And they're messengers of truth. And so he's setting up here what's about to happen, okay? And that's an important part, that whether it's titular or functional, that debate aside, what Luke's clearly doing here syntactically in terms of the structure of the passage, how it flows, right, is he's setting up the message that he's about to bring that they're about to bring in contrast to the current concept of what the Greeks here think is going, what the Lystrans think are going on. So, where are I? Yeah, 14. So when they hear it, they tore their garments and rushed down in the crowd. Again, tearing of garments was a kind of wasn't exclusively Jewish, but it was an ancient very obvious remonstration of anger or outrage. The Sanhedrin do it, for example, when they've arrested Jesus, and then when they ask him point blank, "Are you God?" and then he responds by quoting Daniel chapter 7 about seeing the Son of Man coming in the clouds, right, which is this proclamation of judgment from Daniel 7. And so that's clearly identifying him as the Messiah. It's also identifying him as God, because this one who comes on the clouds in heaven and comes up to the Ancient of Days, he's then enthroned and he's given all dominion and power and authority, blah, blah, when you read through Daniel 7. Very clearly referring that to himself. And they in their outrage at Jesus daring to call himself the Messiah, even though he's been showing it point blank for like 3 years. And everyone is expecting the Messiah to come at this time anyway. They decide nonetheless in their pride and their arrogance to be outraged, and they tear their garments, right? So here, again, the apostles, Paul and Barnabas, are outraged at them receiving worship from the pagans, right? And they work very quickly to resolve that, okay? Is the nice way of putting it. And so they rush out into the crowd, and here's what they say in verse 15. "Men, why are you doing these things? Why, we also are men of the same nature as you, proclaiming the gospel to you, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God." They try to temper the crowd by telling them we're just men, we're only men, hence the rage, we're men of the same nature as you, right? We're not divine, in other words. And we're proclaiming the evangelion, the gospel, the good news to you, that you should turn from these vain things, these empty things. I'm not even, let me go back. I have a funny feeling that eidolon might be used here. Let me go back into my Greek translation. What verse is it? 15. No, okay. So it's, mataion. So like vanity, useless. You could probably also say in English as well. Useless, unproductive. Yeah, a couple of different words. But it's empty, right? It's vain. It's worthless. It's a wasted time, right? And so turning from that, right? From that kind of idolization, right? Idolatry in that sense. That when they see this miraculous thing occur, their first thought is to jump to these ancient idols which have kept them enslaved in darkness for thousands of years at this point. The good news, and this speaks to something broader. Let me read the rest of it, because that'll then influence what's being said. "Turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." Again, that's very clearly an allusion back to no shortage of Old Testament texts. Even just the incipit of Genesis chapter 1, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's very clearly part of the reference. The reference to the sea and all the earth, and the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. That phrase or that axiom in Hebrew is used many, many times in the Old Testament. He is speaking to the concept, even just as far as we've read thus far, of turning from the vain, empty, worthless, pointless pursuit of idols, right, and the powers behind them, to the God who created all things. Why worship lesser gods when you can worship the one creator God? Okay. It doesn't deny the spiritual reality. It doesn't deny the reality that there are such spiritual powers. What it's pointing to, though, is there is but one creator God. There is but one Elohim, to use the Hebrew word for God. There is but one God who created all things, right? And as God said in ancient times in the Old Testament, in Jeremiah's day, and he said so in the pagan language of Aramaic, so in the ethnic language of Aramaic, the language of the pagans around them. To paraphrase his words, he said, "All the gods which have been formed from the heavens and the earth will be crushed beneath them." right? The basic underlying premise of pagan deities was that one way or another they came forth from the kind of primordial created elements, so to speak, right? Ultimately, all the Olympian gods, which Zeus and Hermes are included in that, ultimately are descended from Gaia, okay, which is the ancient primordial titan that is the earth, okay, the goddess of the earth, the mother earth, so to speak. And so they come forward from the creation, and that goes pretty much all around the traps. Even the kind of more vague, obscure pagan mythologies like the Polynesian, for example, right? So native Maori paganism from pre-colonial times. Been a while since I've read this story, but long story short, everything we see came from the heavens, these two primordial deities, male and female personified, coming together and then producing everything else. So it's the creation begetting creation. Does that make sense? There's no pagan mythology that has all of creation coming from a deity.
An everlasting one.
That's what I'm referring to, yeah. That precedes the very concept, the very creation of time itself. There's no concept of that to the pagans because none of the deities they worshipped were that way, right? None of the gods, lowercase g, had actually preceded creation. They had all come from creation because they all were created, right? There is only one created God. So don't get freaked out when you hear me using the kind of lowercase g gods in a plural sense because they were worshipped as such. But they are created entities. They're not the one created God, right? Exactly. That is from everlasting to everlasting, that is eternal by definition because he is the only one who has existed forever and he precedes time. He created time, right? He created time when he created the world. And to precede the creation of time is to be eternal by definition. And so here he's pointing them away from the darkness of worship and the futility, more importantly, because again he's using the word vain or futile, right? Away from the futility of worshipping lesser gods and lesser spiritual powers, and instead turn to the only living God, the one eternal creator God, from whom everything came, right? It's why, by the way, because we'll get onto another, he makes another point that's really important here as well from verse 16 onward. But it's why, just even at a basic level, paganism doesn't make sense. Like, it doesn't make sense to do it. Why would you worship this tier of gods as opposed to the one who created them? Not for that purpose. He didn't create them to be worshipped falsely by the nations, right? They rebelled in that. They rebelled in that sense. But why would you worship this lot when you can worship the singular God who created them in the first place? It just doesn't make it. It doesn't even make sense on a logical or a functional front. Getting back to the flow of the argument, though.
Can I make a point here?
Go for you.
I was just thinking, does that result in these Lycaonian people believing? Because remember earlier on in Acts, we get the phrase, and many believed.
Yep.
And many turned, similar phrases. That phrase is absent from these sort of chapters onwards.
It's certainly that specific wording is absent here for sure. The only thing that kind of gives a pause for consideration would be later on. It's next week, obviously, not this morning, but later on in verse 23. And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed and fasted, we're not told which city, though, on this journey those churches were in. Oh, well, obviously, okay, they would have been definitely in. There was obviously church in Pisidian Antioch, and also definitely Iconium. But other than that,
I noticed that in chapter 14, verse 21, when they're in Derbe.
Yep.
Derby.
Yep, Derbe.
And after they preached in that city and made many worthy disciples.
Yeah.
So disciples and believers are still being made.
Yep.
But the Lycaonians were a hard nut to crack.
Hard nut to crack, definitely, yeah, exactly. So whether or not we're not giving any specific reference, whether they're included in that generic reference to church, because immediately after that phraseology there in verse 21, they returned to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch. So this is them, their journey back is they're just backtracking, right? Yeah. But are they ministering again? Are they making sure that the churches they've set up in that have been found in those cities, or maybe...
Well, that's their pattern, isn't it?
Do you know what I mean? Yeah, so I think the fact that Lystra gets mentioned gives us, let me put it this way, it gives us more reason to think that a church was established than not established.
Well, that's saying...
But yeah.
That's saying something very significant then, is it not? Because these were hard pagans.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And
they
got cracked.
Very right. Yes, exactly. And once we get to this passage, there'll be a broader meta-narrative point about how Paul goes about that, right? But let's continue in verse 16 so that we can get to that point. He's still speaking here in verse 16. In the generations gone by, he, referring to God, in generations gone by, God permitted all the nations to go their own ways. And yet he did not leave himself without witness, in that he did good and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling your hearts with food and with gladness. Okay. What he's pointing to here is what we refer to in theological terms as general revelation. Okay. So the fundamental of this is that God has revealed himself in two primary ways. They're not separate. They're not even mutually exclusive at all. They're completely intertwined, but they're two just different categories of the way that we think of them, right? God has revealed himself and his existence and his nature and everything else through that which has been made, okay? Through the fact that things exist at all demands that they must have somehow come into being. It's why every single culture in the history of the world, including even the atheistic, materialistic one in which of that philosophy which dominates at the moment in the West, all of it has an origin story. Even the modern materialists, the atheists, have their own origin story, erroneous as it is. But everyone has to have, because it demands an explanation. Right? The fact that anything exists demands that there must have been a way in which it came to exist, or at least a reasoning for how it got to this point. Obviously, for many of the Eastern religions, Buddhism and many of the other Eastern philosophies, they postulate that the world has eternally existed. Not only do we know that's not logically true, we also now scientifically know that's not true. The universe clearly had a beginning, right? That's been demonstrably proven, and it's just impossible to argue against that. Again, we already knew that logically, and we also knew that theologically, but science eventually catches up to the Bible on that. Moreover, he's revealed himself not only through that which has been made, and through the fact that we can see consistency in the world around us, we can see logic, we can see order, we can see beauty. Again, the very concept of beauty, aesthetically or otherwise, demands a mind behind it, right? Because there is no material, scientific, in a generic sense, way of codifying beauty. Okay, it's why naturalism, which is the philosophy that especially the kind of empiricist Enlightenment tradition, right? The David Hume type of empiricism from the Enlightenment, which basically says only that which can be perceived through my senses is what's real, right? And that which can be measured, in other words, that which can be codified scientifically, that's the only things that are real. Then go ahead and try to use the scientific method to not only define but even demonstrate what on earth love is, what on earth beauty is, what on earth goodness is. But you can't, because these are not scientific categories. And so that's the inherent flaw, and with all due respect to people, the foolishness of naturalism. Okay, and that the empiricist line, particularly of the Enlightenment. You can't codify these things. All of these things, though, demand a designer. They demand, logically and biblically, more importantly, they demand that indeed there has been a creator who has made these things, and that explains beauty, it explains goodness, it explains all of these things. That part aside, that's just the general revelation. The more important and specific part is that word, what we call specific revelation or special revelation, whichever word you like to use, but specific revelation, and that's what we're all reading here, right? It's the specifics, hence the term, of what God has done throughout history and his interactions and communications with the world, with his people, everything else in between. Okay. Obviously, when we're in Deuteronomy, right? Much of what we did not the recent Sunday, but the first lesson, was just introducing and trying to give a Cliff Notes version of where on earth we are in the Bible, and here's what the first 4 books have said thus far, right? Because it doesn't just come down, it's not just happening in a vacuum. It's not like the Quran from Islam, which is the esoteric, cryptic, almost mystical revelations of one single man sitting in a cave for 20 years, that's just been given to one dude in history. It's 40 authors over the course of nearly 1,500 years, from different times, in different languages, with different cultures, all testifying to the same ultimate thing through history, right?
Imagine presenting that concept for a book to your publisher.
Yeah, true. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, that's why we should do our own publishing like we have historically, as opposed to giving a hoot what Penguin wants. Yeah, we need to publish our own things like we have historically, for that reason. But that's just the basic reality of it. It's not slanderous. That is what the Quran is, and that is in comparison what the Bible is. There's nothing. It's completely factual. Like no one can disagree with that. That's why you end up having to have wacky doctrines in Islam, like the fact that the Quran is eternal, which presents a gigantic problem that very few Muslim imams or scholars actually have the guts to touch with a 10-foot pole. Yeah, because you now have this other entity other than Allah, which is also eternal, and what implications does that have for his eternal deity? Just gets left out there in the Islamic ether, never answered. No matter how hard you press, and then I've been there and done that. I've pressed.
God love them. They're not philosophers, but
well, they used to be back in the Middle Ages, but they banned that a long time ago.
The biting irony for us is that today, as you very well know, it's far easier to talk to a Muslim about God than it is to an Australian.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yes, to the average secular Australian, because and just like it is here, because the Muslim is under no illusion that somehow God does not exist. Because without being smart, they're not that foolish, right? Just like these Greeks were not so foolish as to think that there was nothing divine in or about the world, right? There's nothing spiritual. There was just purely material, and we all got here because of an unguided natural material process that no one can seem to explain comprehensively or cohesively at all.
For which there's no shred of evidence.
For which we don't have any long-standing, any actual observable evidence that seems to kind of comport with that beyond just the natural...
According to the scientific method,
the natural adaptations.
Follow the science.
Yeah. No, I know, that's the thing, is it's not, if someone could actually... So I know I'll jump on the bandwagon because it's been mentioned, so it might as well be worth saying. I've almost lost count. I almost genuinely have. It would probably be like, maybe, I don't know, 20-something probably by now, of times that I've asked someone, be they student or professor, to actually just explain to me scientifically how on earth you know this, right? You're particularly if they're of the neo-Darwinian kind of strand. And literally none of them have. For starters, they can't even give a codified answer that even represents what anyone else has said. They also can't explain, they just simply can't explain basic things like why doesn't this seem to comport with our understanding of thermodynamics and second law of thermodynamics particularly. Why doesn't this seem to comport with what we understand now, especially now in the 21st century about like genetic entropy,
or the complexity of a cell,
the complexity of the cell, the fact you have elements of the cell that. So then they're not ridiculous questions. Like they're not like, oh no, you guys are lying because I don't want to believe it. I'm doing like the kind of monkey no see, monkey no hear, monkey no speak. Like it's not that I'm playing. I'm asking for a genuine. Like if you can give me an answer, give me an answer. And you can't give me.
We just keep it simple. You say, how can nothing explode and form everything? How can nothing explode? It doesn't make sense.
Well, the singularity, the singularity is the postulated concept, And so how do we know that? Again, you don't beyond mathematical, logical kind of reduction back to an almost infinite regression, which already presents its own logical problems because regressing to an infinite is a logical fallacy usually. All these kinds of things. But again, that's why I said the conversation before we came in, we were talking along the same subject before the lesson. And the point being made is that you have to study these things not in a vacuum, but in history. Evolutionary theories, particularly that of neo-Darwinism, which is the dominant strain today, it's not the only one, but it's the dominant strain, are far, far, far more of a philosophy than they are a hard observable science. And once you understand that,
and they know it.
and understanding its place in history, and they know it, true, good point. You kind of see rather clearly that if this had have popped up 1,000 years ago, it may have had more weight. I'm saying maybe, in a very, very hypothetical sense, not in a serious sense. But the fact that it just happens to pop up in the century immediately after the Enlightenment, where the entire premise of that was that there either is no God or there is a God, but he kind of just set it all in motion and just kicked his feet back up and had a cigar and just chilled out, which is the essence of deism. It's an origin story. Well, it's a worldview looking for an origin story to fill the gap in, and it can be thoroughly defeated by logical premises. It can be defeated on scientific premises, and kind of just has been. There's no shortage of times that it has been. It's just it requires that, because when you eliminate the very obvious reality of the fact that anything exists demands that it must have come about by some reasoning. And also, without being smart, speaking of the Greeks, something that Aristotle himself figured out, not that he's the authority, right? This tells you that God created it, and that's the beginning and the end of the story. You don't need anything beyond that, right? So it's presuppositional truth in that sense. But even the pagan philosophers of Greece knew this, right? Aristotle knew this. What he referred to as the unmoved mover. Now, there were issues with that concept, but he very simply figured out that if an apple tree produces apples and it falls upon the ground, and then the seeds from that apple become another apple tree, and then it produces a tree which produces apples that then fall on the ground, and the seeds from that become a tree which falls on the ground. Rewind that clock backwards, something had to begin that process of the first tree, which produced the first apples, which produced the first seeds, which would then fall on the ground. Right, and so there must be someone specifically determining, which began that process, and he also must be eternal. Right, this is the Greek philosophers like Aristotle, stumbling around in the dark, sort of kind of heading towards the door, but never really making it. But they were heading in the right direction, at least broadly speaking, sort of kind of.
Actually, they were very close.
That's my point about the door. Yeah,
They were very close.
yeah. That's God preparing the Hellenistic culture. It's literally no surprise at all that it's in a Hellenistic world that Christ enters into and that the church is born into, as opposed to Babylonian, Persian, Egyptian, anything else in between.
Mind you, I mean, we've got to remember that according to chapter 10 of Genesis, the Table of Nations,
I'll get onto them in a minute. Yeah.
they all had the truth.
Yes.
And as the peoples expanded across the landscape after the flood, they still had the core of truth, but it was corrupted.
No, corrupted, exactly. Yes, exactly. And that's why you find, you mentioned the flood, and it's like, oh, you can't seriously believe that there was a massive flood that happened in the ancient world. Well, everyone in the ancient world did, and it's not. So the Egyptians have it, the Babylonians have it, the Persians have it, the Greeks have it, the Norse have it, the Chinese have it, the Australians have it, the Maoris have it, the Inca have it, the Mayans have it, the Aztecs have it, the Native Americans have it. They all have this accounting of a great flood that happened in the ancient world, and they were all lying. That's your opinion. Like, just at what point does it not make rational sense? Like, how much more they all said, and some of whom, by a very quick point, wouldn't know the other one even existed. The Babylonians had zero concept of the existence of the Australians, right? Of the indigenous Australians. In that sense, by the time you get to the time of the scriptures. So, but they both have these story. They both have story, and the Chinese, and I'm saying all around the place. It's not. Why do you believe that? Well, because they all say so. What do you mean? You think they were all lying? Like, it's just. that's infinitely less likely than the fact that it didn't happen. And that's before we talk about physical evidences of it in the first place. But anyway, to use round numbers, approximately, again, this is debated even theologically, but ballparking it, it's in the third millennium BC. So but to ballpark it, I would say somewhere in the range of approximately 2,600 to 2,800 BC. Again, that requires a lot more explanation and a lot more, because there is some, genuine debate as to the specific dating of that. But it's in ancient times that are thousands of years even before this particular point. And we find that, and it was ancient to everyone. That's how we know it was ancient, because all these different cultures clearly tell you that even in their time, it was ancient, right? So like to the Babylonians in like 1,000 to 500 BC, this was an ancient flood. To the Greeks, it was an ancient flood. And so they're ancient to us, but this to them was ancient, if that makes sense, yeah. And all these various cultures quite clearly tell of this happening. And again, science usually ends up playing catch up. You already have secular scientists very clearly explaining a massive, massive flood descending upon the earth after the Younger Dryas period, to use their kind of classifications of things, that you see evidences of across different continents. You see it in North America, you see it in Africa, you see it in South America, Europe, Asia, etc. And of a massive, humongous flooding of all kinds of regions around the world, and they're not approaching it from the literal perspective of what the Bible says about it. They're starting with the geological evidence of humongous flooding, and not just like a regional monsoon, of like big level floodings on a continental scale, that have massive runoffs, and all kinds of other effects. And then they're perfectly happy to point to the fact that all kinds of cultures around the world are clearly saying that there was a flood. So I'll pause on that one so we can finish on this. So he says he did not leave himself without a witness, right? He did good, right? He did righteous things. He did that which was good for people, and he gave them rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling your hearts with food and with gladness, right? Everything that they have has come ultimately from God. It hasn't come from the lesser gods which come forth from creation in the first place. It's come from the God who actually created those various things, not the other way around. Hence why his reference back in verse 15 was to turn away from the vain foolishness of worshipping these lesser gods which come forward from the creation. In other words, they are created, but instead turn to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Not the other way around. Again, you have Greek gods who came forth and were born out of the sea, right? And so you were born out of the land, who were born out of mixtures between other gods and the land. You have all these kinds of various things, even the human element, right? They think that Barnabas is Zeus, and for anyone with even an elementary knowledge of Greek mythology would know that just about half the gods, I'm using that not in a literal sense, but practically half the gods came from Zeus sleeping with some princess or some priestess or some queen of such and such, right? So many of them, many of them came forward in that sense. Even be they demigods or the great heroes like Heracles, right? Who you probably know better by his Latin name as Hercules. Again, his name Heracles, the strength of Hera, was not Hera. It was the wife of Zeus, and Heracles was very much not born from Hera. Forget exactly who his mother was off memory, but anyway, nonetheless, the entire story of Heracles is Hera, the wife of Zeus, trying to basically ruin his life because of how angry she was at Zeus for the 27,000th time, having slept with some maiden or queen or such and such of woman. And so it's all coming forth from the creation, not the other way around. He,
have any reality, or were they just the imagination?
Great question. So the answer is no, they were not just mere imagination, and we can't, mainly because it becomes impossible to derive from ancient sources, be they biblical or not biblical, that they were just merely kind of, use that wording, like the figment of people's imaginations. For starters, it's extremely difficult to build an entire civilization on just pure myth and imagination, because it requires like millions of people having like a shared collective imagination or hallucination.
Are we
almost.
talking about Hercules?
Oh, any of the Greek gods. So what the question being asked is, were all the Greek gods just pure figments of imagination?
This is a 3-hour topic.
Yeah. I'm trying to,
I'll say this though.
It is, go and jump in.
The word giant comes from the Greek word gigantos,
Correct.
which doesn't mean giant.
No.
It means fallen one.
Fallen one, yeah.
And where do we get that? We get that from Genesis chapter 6.
Yeah.
The sons of God, the fallen angels, came in to the daughters of men, to actual women. So we've got
Relations.
gods procreating with humans to produce giants. And we've got the geological, anthropological evidence. Giant femurs were unearthed across America in the 1800s when the railroads were being ploughed through the continent. And those bones are documented. You've got photographs being printed in newspapers of the 1860s, for example, clearly of giants. Those bones have mysteriously disappeared because they were,
to a degree,
they were taken to the Smithsonian Institution.
It wasn't the narrative.
And never seen again.
No, that's right.
in one sense, yeah. I mean, sometimes they are, but the broader point, even before you get to the archaeological element, is it's the same concept with like the flood. You don't even need to get to the archaeology, because that's cart before the horse. Your point's perfectly valid, but I'm just saying simply cart before the horse.
And by the way, giants are the Titans.
Yes, correct.
The Titans were enormous, strong.
Exactly. Who the Olympian
were
gods
they?
defeated, yeah. So exactly, and you find these. It's just like with the flood. Like you have cultures all around the world having very consistent stories about gods having been created, and various other things like a big flood, as well as these other encounters with these giants. And again, to our modern post-Enlightenment mindset in the West, it seems either silly or trivial or odd or just plain stupid and nonsense. But again, that comes from a level of scholastic cynicism, over which basically kind of starts and finishes with the premise that all those who came before us were a bunch of idiots and were buffoons, and that people in ancient times didn't know what they were talking about because, I don't know, they didn't have the steam engine or the iPhone or something. And that apparently everyone who came before the Enlightenment and the subsequent Industrial Revolution and everything else were just a bunch of absolute morons who can't be trusted with anything. It's just pure cynicism at that point, of thinking that all those who came before us were idiots, and that now that we are so advanced and so enlightened, and we are the great, the Western civilization's falling apart at the seams.
Are you
So we might
saying
want
we're
to.
demigods?
Huh?
Modern demigods?
Well, we almost view ourselves that
That's
way.
what
Yeah.
they view themselves as.
Almost view ourselves, yeah,
Godly.
exactly. We almost view ourselves that way, yeah. And yeah, exactly. And we're kind of just standing around playing a grand game of The Emperor Has No Clothes, pretending that Western civilization isn't like falling apart around us, while thinking that this is the greatest thing we've ever done. No, the West is going to get humbled very, very quickly. But that part aside, the point being here though, is that were they the root of the question was, were they just purely imaginary? No, is the answer I would give to that. And here's why I would give that. One, because none of the people ever there's nothing to indicate that any of these people considered it to be imaginary. Now that's not proof in the pudding, but it's kind of a foundation point, right? Moreover, it becomes really difficult to explain a lot of the stories that get told. It also becomes difficult to explain how on earth entire civilizations were built like be it the Greeks or the Babylonians or whoever, just based on like basically everyone getting around, like millions of people getting around and like commonly agreeing that we're all just going to lie to each other for the next couple of 100 years, right? And we're all just going to like collectively lie. We all know it's not true, but right, yeah, it doesn't make logical. Yeah, no, they 100% believe. No one like they definitely believed it, and more importantly, they had reasons to believe. Like they had reasons to believe it. Moreover, the more important side of the equation is not necessarily the evidence from the pagan side of the equation, although that should be taken into consideration. The more important thing is this, right? So this clearly presents it as a reality. I don't know, have we had it yet? No, it's coming up in coming chapters. Paul is in, if I'm not mistaken, Ephesus in a couple of chapters, in chapter 16, I think, on his way to Athens in chapter 17. In Ephesus in chapter 16, which is I'm pretty sure where it is, he encounters a priestess of Apollo. Apollo, one of the most important of the Greek gods, represented many things. But long story short, he was representative of order, of truth. He was associated with the sun, as opposed to his sister Artemis, associated with the moon. With Dionysius, I should say. Dionysius, who was associated with chaos and with libation and drunkenness and orgy and blah blah blah. So like order and chaos diametrically opposed between Apollo and Dionysius. The temple at Delphi, which is in Greece, up on Mount Parnassus, kind of midway up the peninsula, was the single most important religious site, not only in Greece, but pretty much the whole world. And the priestess, the capital P priestess of Apollo at Delphi was known as the Pythia, which just comes from a word which means the pythoness, right? Why that? Python, which is where we get the generic term for that genus of snake, comes from the ancient Greek god Python, who was a chaos monster, a chaos serpent, who Apollo kills in the Greek mythology. Okay, I'm running you through the story here. He then builds a temple at the former dwelling place of Python, the Python, after having slain it, and that is the temple of Apollo, dedicated to Apollo at Delphi. And she was the most powerful religious figure, not only in Greece, but even in this day, the most powerful religious figure in the world, other than the Pontifex Maximus, which was the emperor, the Roman emperor. The Pythia was still very much regarded as the most powerful religious figure in the world, and even the Romans went to consult the Pythia. He then encounters Paul in Ephesus, just a generic priestess of Apollo. Okay, so not the Pythia, but a priestess of Apollo, and she's telling fortunes in the city. Right? Paul then has an encounter with her, where he then casts the spiritual force out of her, the demonic force out of her, and she can't tell fortunes anymore. Okay. Now, there's many things to take from that story, and we'll get to that when we get there. But one of the logical implications of what we're told there, is there's nothing in that text that presents that somehow she was like pretending to tell fortunes, but like wasn't really. Because if she was just pretending and there's nothing spiritual going on, nothing dark or evil going on, she would have just kept telling fortunes. Like, it was just like a parlor trick, like, with a deck of cards kind of thing, right? She would have just kept on going telling fortunes. If it was all just, the whole spiritual side was just fake, she could have just simply kept on telling. There's no explanation other than the spiritual element of that power behind her was real, because now she can't tell fortunes anymore. She's unable to do it, even though she would have wanted to. And so that story inherently assumes that the spiritual force or power behind it was real. And again, these things are not odd at all. No one in ancient times this was perfectly normal to people. In medieval times, it was normal to people. It's only odd on the surface to us post-Enlightenment in Europe, which was heavily based on rationalism and empiricism, and the concept that there either is no God or that there is a God, but he really just kind of set the world in motion and doesn't have any interaction with it, and he just kind of kicks back and does nothing about it. Right? That's called deism, which is as I said, he just sets the world in motion and just lets things play out, and God doesn't interact or do anything with the world at all. So it shouldn't seem odd when you actually put yourself in the place of not only those who wrote it, but more importantly, those who received it, right? Those who were the recipients of these ancient texts, like the Book of Acts and everything else. The fundamental premise is yes, no, the spiritual powers behind it were definitively real. And the point here that Paul is making is it is wrong to honour and to worship and to idolise these spiritual powers because they don't run the show, they didn't create anything. They've been created by God, and you're attributing false worship to them because only God, who created all things, is worthy to be worshipped because he's the only one who's eternal. He's the only one who is the creator. He's the only one who is the true God, who we call the Most High God, because he created all things. And to him, therefore, worship, right, honouring and loving and being in communion with him is only to be directed towards him, not these lesser gods, as the people treated them, who have been created by God for a purpose, and that purpose is not to receive the worship from people, because God is who is the only one who's worthy of receiving that. Does that? I know that's the super condensed answer, because like he said earlier, it was about to kick open a 3-hour can of worms. But yeah, the answer is no, it's not just pure superstition. And nothing in the Bible, nor in the pagan text, ever presents it as just completely kind of made up or it doesn't mean there was any shortage of superstition. For sure, there 100% was. But the superstition isn't plenary, so it's not like, 100% of it's superstition. No, the superstition comes out of a kind of real core, if that makes sense. And so then he just simply finishes in verse 18 here, saying these things with difficulty they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifices to them. So they made not just verbal but physical efforts to stop people from. So when you see something like that, again, we're only given a sentence about it, but the image that should come into mind is something more along the ballpark. Something less along the ballpark of just polite words and more along the lines of flipping tables in the temple court, right? That's the image that should be brought to mind. They were physically trying to stop them from doing this because they knew the seriousness of don't worship us. We're not gods. I'll finish on this broad meta-narrative point, which is this, because we alluded to it earlier. Notice here that there is not a grand exposition of Old Testament stories. So notice Abraham doesn't get mentioned, Moses does not get mentioned, David doesn't, blah, blah. As had been mentioned in previous chapters, right? What he points to here, very specifically, is he points to the fact that they are worshipping vain things and should instead turn to the living God, the one true God, the creator God who made all the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything that's in them, right? He explains, again, things that are not unfamiliar to the Old Testament. Like the theology is from the Old Testament, but they're not specific instances of Abraham and Moses, because none of these people would have known who that is. Instead, he points to the fact that in previous generations, in times past, or in generations gone, he permitted the nations to go their own way. Yes. Not because it was good or righteous, but that's what occurred after the flood when humanity rebelled again, and they built the Tower of Babel in Mesopotamia, which is not unfamiliar. Again, it was we see this kind of same imagery of building tower-like structures in Mesopotamian ziggurats, in Egyptian pyramids, in the Mesoamerican pyramids, like the famous period of Tenochtitlan at the Aztec capital. The Incan civilization, the China, all different cultures have built mountain-like structures. They've been different. Egyptian pyramids are different from Mesopotamian ziggurats, but they're similar mountain-like structures like the Tower of Babel was, for the purpose of specifically because the gods were thought to reside, and understandably so, upon high places, mountains, right? For a variety of reasons, but the simplistic one being that the mountains are higher and closer to the heavens, so therefore that's where the gods are, right? The reason why the Greek gods are referred to as the Olympian gods is because they were thought to reside on Mount Olympos up in northern Greece. And I believe the Titans who they defeated were on Mount Ida, I believe. Don't quote me on that. But nonetheless, the mountains are where it's associated with. That comes up all the time. Again, without being smart, that's not in... Even the Bible points that towards being a relatively correct symbology, right? Where is the law given? Mount Sinai. Where is Jerusalem located? Mount Zion. It's all mountains, right? It's mountains. And the mountain, so that indication is given quite, and that's given at many other places. I won't go into it now because I wouldn't do it justice. But when Christ is at Caesarea Philippi, in John 12, I think it is, when he's at Caesarea Philippi, which was a super religious city, it was home to what at that point in history was called the Cave of Pan, which is a very interesting and enigmatic god in Greek mythology. It was also home to a very massive imperial cult, and in fact pretty much one of the biggest imperial cults not in Rome and not in Pergamum. At Caesarea Philippi, it was the biggest in that eastern part of the empire for sure, hence the name Caesarea Philippi. It was also obviously named after the Herodian Tetrarch Philip. So you've got this confluence of the Roman imperial influence, the Idumean Herodian influence, and then the religious influence from Greece and everywhere else. That's a big rock. It's a big mountain there, right? Sizable rock, and that's where the Cave of Pan is and blah, blah. And so that's the context in which Christ says, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades, the underworld, death, will not prevail. The fact that it occurred in Caesarea Philippi is the bona fide proof of what the rock is, right? He's using a pun because Petros, the name for Peter, means rock. And then he says, upon this Petra, this rock, the one he's standing on, I will build my church. More importantly, and then the reference specifically of the gates of Hades, because you know what's that, blah, blah. At Caesarea Philippi, and specifically the Cave of Pan, that was thought to be by the pagans to be a gate to the underworld, a gate to hell, a gate to Hades, or the land, the realm of the dead. That was their belief. So upon the gates of Hades, so he's standing on top of this place that the pagans thought to be this gate to the underworld and symbolizing spiritual darkness and blah, blah. And upon this rock, I will build my church. I will crush the powers of darkness and the kingdom of this world, and I will build my kingdom upon the top of it. Understanding those things and context is what's really important here. He is speaking to them not only at a level, but in a way that they would understand. So it shows that, at least to our degree, the contextualization of the gospel is something which makes sense without changing the substance, right? Contextualization of the gospel goes awry when you change the substance. But contextualizing it, making it actually understandable to the audience to whom you're speaking, is very clearly something that's presented in Acts, okay? And he does that because when he's talking to the Jews, it's all about Abraham, it's all about Moses, it's all about David, and rightly so, right? Makes sense. When he's talking here, and even a couple of chapters later, when he talks when he talks in a far more intimidating place like Athens, he's using fundamental biblical truth, and you don't get the reference to Abraham, you don't get the reference to Moses, because they didn't have a clue who that was. And so rattling off guys who they don't know who on earth that is just doesn't make logistical sense, because you wouldn't get halfway through the first of the opening part of the speech without everyone kind of glazing over and going, who the heck are you talking about? So he talks rather to the bigger picture issues. Not that they're more important or less important, but I'm just talking bigger in scope of, you are worshipping lesser gods who have been created. They're not worthy of worship. Because when you read the stories, it's not, and this is me saying this as a theologian, the Greek gods, the Romans, which are just taken from the Greek gods, the Babylonian gods, the Egyptian gods, the Norse gods, right? So the gods of the Germanic peoples, the Vikings, and so aren't, like, they're not trying to be rude, they don't impress me at all. For starters, they can die, and they do die, especially to the Norse. their eschatological end of the world event, Ragnarok, and there's debate as to what that means. But long story short, in that story, almost all the gods die. Certainly the important ones do, right? Odin dies in his fight against Fenrir, the great wolf. Thor dies while slaying Jormungandr, who's the world serpent, this serpent of chaos that dwells in the sea. Right, all these kinds of things.
Not another serpent.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah. Well, serpents have been associated with chaos for a variety of reasons, and they are in here too. Don't get me started on that because I wrote a very lengthy paper about that.
I wonder where that comes from.
I wrote a very, very lengthy paper about that at college, which is fascinating, which I never get to share with people. It's one of my favourite subjects. But anyway, don't give it in that set because you're about to kick open a door you won't be able to walk back from. Yes, but the gods die in those stories, in many of them. Do you know what I mean?
So they're not eternal then.
No, but they're never presented to be eternal. They're never presented as eternal. They can die, and in many instances they do, especially in the north, where they almost all die, other than like a couple. Why? It's not. It just doesn't even make sense.
No.
But that's the shroud of darkness they'd been kept in. That's the shroud of darkness that they'd willingly remained in for centuries. They worshipped these lesser gods who did what we want them to do, and really though, they were playing you, not the other way around. But anyway, it's kind of tit for tat. It's reciprocal. But in reality, no, he is pointing them towards the God who created the gods. Does that make sense? The God who created the divine council. So to use the Old Testament term, the divine assembly. Don't worship that which has come forth from the creation. You worship the one who created the creation in the first place. That's why his words to the pagans in Jeremiah, 600-ish BC roughly, he says to them in their own tongue. He switches out of Hebrew and goes into Aramaic and says, to paraphrase, all the gods which have come forth from the creation, right, been born of the creation, will be crushed beneath it, right? Specifically, he says, all the gods which have come forth from the heavens and the earth will be crushed beneath the heavens and the earth, right? Symbolizing judgment, right? Because in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So therein we finish. Any other final kind of comments and questions? Again, this story keeps flowing through. So if there are, maybe some questions end up getting answered in coming weeks. But the story keeps running through till 2023, and then we get the finishing of the story through the rest of the end of the chapter. But anyway, are there any questions or comments about what we looked at specifically verses 8 to 18 here? Good. All right, cool. Next lesson we'll begin continuing on through the story in verse 19. Cool. Thank you.